You finished the entire meal, paid the bill in full, and left the restaurant several hours ago now. And yet, right now, some quiet corner of your mind is still holding on to that one unsent text message, that one half-written email sitting in your drafts folder, that one argument that ended mid-sentence when someone abruptly walked away. Meanwhile, the actual delicious meal you just recently finished, thoroughly completed and fully resolved in every practical sense, has already quietly vanished entirely from active memory. This is not merely a random coincidence, and it is not simply ordinary anxiety at work here. It is a specific, well-documented psychological phenomenon that quietly shapes far more of your daily life than you probably ever consciously realize. That it is called the Zeigarnik Effect, named directly after Lithuanian psychologist Bluma Zeigarnik, who first carefully documented it back in the 1920s after a genuinely curious observation at a busy Vienna café. Zeigarnik noticed that skilled waiters could effortlessly remember incredibly detailed, complicated orders, but only for exactly as long as those specific orders remained fully unpaid and technically still open. The exact instant a bill was finally and fully settled, the waiter's vivid memory of the entire complete order would rapidly and almost completely fade away, sometimes within just a few very short minutes. Intrigued by this genuinely odd pattern, Zeigarnik brought the observation directly into her formal laboratory setting. She had participants work on a fairly long series of simple tasks, such as solving puzzles or assembling small objects, but deliberately interrupted them partway through roughly half of those tasks before they could ever actually finish. Later, when participants were asked to freely recall which specific tasks they had worked on, they remembered the interrupted, unfinished tasks considerably better, often close to twice as well, compared to the tasks they had actually managed to fully complete. The underlying explanation researchers have proposed centers on a concept called cognitive tension. When you begin any task, your brain creates a kind of active, open mental loop that stays engaged and alert as long as that specific goal remains unresolved. Completing a task allows the brain to formally close that particular loop, releasing the associated cognitive tension and effectively filing the memory neatly away. But an interrupted or unfinished task leaves that exact loop open and actively unresolved, and your brain, in a genuine sense, keeps quietly working in the background to somehow finish it, repeatedly pulling your conscious attention back towards it at unpredictable and often deeply inconvenient moments. This single mechanism quietly explains an enormous range of everyday human experiences that otherwise seem completely unrelated to one another. It explains why a cliffhanger ending on a television show feels so genuinely difficult to simply walk away from, even when you're truly exhausted and desperately need real sleep. It explains why a to-do list sitting quietly on your kitchen counter can somehow generate a persistent, low-grade hum of background anxiety throughout your entire day, even while you're actively doing something else entirely unrelated. It explains why an argument that ends abruptly, without any real resolution or closure, tends to replay itself relentlessly in your mind for days, weeks, or sometimes even years afterward, long after the other person involved has seemingly moved on completely. Consider something as ordinary as reading a genuinely gripping novel. You fully intend to stop reading after just one more short chapter, and yet somehow it becomes 3 or 4 chapters instead, almost entirely against your own conscious will and better judgment. Each individual chapter typically ends on a small, deliberately unresolved question, and your brain, still actively holding that specific open loop from the previous chapter, keeps quietly pulling your attention forward, page after page, well past the point where genuine curiosity alone would reasonably explain your continued reading. The exact same underlying mechanism also helps explain a fairly common and often genuinely distressing experience: intrusive, repetitive thoughts about a specific mistake made at work. Long after a minor error has technically already been corrected and formally resolved by everyone involved, the brain can continue replaying it internally, precisely because the original emotional loop, the underlying feeling of embarrassment or perceived incompetence, was never actually and fully addressed or processed, even though the practical, external task itself was genuinely completed. Perhaps most strikingly of all, the Zeigarnik Effect helps genuinely explain why sudden, unresolved breakups so often hurt considerably more, and for noticeably longer, than relationships that end through a slow, gradual, mutually understood process over time. When a relationship simply ends abruptly, without any clear conversation, without any real closure, without any honest explanation offered, the relational loop itself remains stubbornly open and unresolved in the mind. The brain, quite literally, has not yet been given sufficient information to properly close that particular file, so it continues actively searching for missing answers, running through countless imagined explanations, replaying the exact same memories on a frustrating, seemingly endless loop. Marketers and content creators have learned to deliberately exploit this exact same underlying psychological mechanism, often quite deliberately and with real precision. Streaming platforms design episodes specifically to end on unresolved tension. Video games intentionally save meaningful progress at inconvenient, unresolved moments to actively encourage players to return and finish. Social media platforms use deliberately unpredictable, intermittent notifications precisely because an unread message, technically speaking, functions as a small, persistent open loop that your brain quietly wants to resolve. Advertising researchers have specifically documented how this same principle shapes consumer behavior in fairly measurable ways. A limited-time promotional offer that abruptly expires at midnight, or a shopping cart deliberately left sitting untouched online. Both function as genuine open loops that quietly nag at attention long after the original browsing session has technically ended. Even email marketing subject lines are frequently written to intentionally withhold a small, crucial piece of information, precisely because a partially answered question reliably generates far more actual clicks than a fully answered one ever consistently does. So, how can understanding the Zeigarnik Effect actually be used constructively in daily life, rather than simply exploited against you by outside platforms and companies looking to profit from your attention? Researchers have found one particularly interesting and genuinely counterintuitive finding worth remembering. You do not necessarily need to fully complete a task in order to meaningfully quiet the underlying cognitive tension it creates. Simply making a clear, concrete plan for exactly when and how you will eventually finish it appears to be nearly as effective as actually finishing the task itself. Writing down a specific, detailed next step for an unfinished project, for example, reliably signals to the brain that the open loop has been genuinely addressed, even though the task itself technically still remains fully unfinished. This single insight forms the practical foundation behind many well-known modern productivity techniques used across countless workplaces today. Keeping a running written list of unfinished tasks, rather than simply trying to hold them all. Actively in working memory frees up genuine mental bandwidth specifically because the brain no longer needs to keep expending scarce cognitive energy anxiously guarding those particular open loops. Some therapists working with anxiety and racing, intrusive thoughts now actively recommend a similar deliberate practice, writing down unresolved worries in concrete, specific detail before bed, which can meaningfully reduce nighttime rumination by giving the brain's persistent open loops somewhere safe and stable to genuinely rest. Understanding the Zeigarnik Effect will not instantly make every single unfinished task in your entire life magically disappear, and it will certainly not make every painful, unresolved ending in your life stop hurting completely overnight. But it does offer a genuinely useful, evidence-based reframe worth holding on to. That nagging thought circling relentlessly in your mind is not necessarily a sign that something is deeply, seriously wrong with you personally. It is simply your own brain doing exactly what brains have always reliably done, quietly keeping meaningful, unfinished business open until it finally receives the closure, or at the very least a clear plan that it genuinely needs if it's finally explained why certain thoughts keep circling back in your mind. Hit like, share it with someone who cannot stop thinking about something unfinished. and subscribe for more real psychology explained clearly.